You're listening to Agile Ideas, the podcast, hosted by Fatimah Abbouchi. For anyone listening out there not having a good day, please know there is help out there. Hi everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Agile Ideas. I'm Fatimah, CEO at AMO, Mental Health Ambassador, and your host. Today we are continuing in the series of Capability Unboxed. We've already previously spoken on episode 1 and 2 about what capability really means and the difference between capability and capacity. And in today's episode, we're going to talk about why organizations treat capabilities and people as the same thing and typically use it interchangeably, and why that actually can break execution. So let's get into episode 3. So when we think about capabilities and the interchangeable way that they are used in organization, think about some of the common messages you might hear or some of the common phrases you might seem to be around, where people are often referring to things as we don't have the capability to do something, or we don't have the capability in our team currently, or we need a capability owner, or who is the responsible owner for this capability, or this capability sits with Sarah, or things like that. A simple example of some of the things we would commonly see in organizations. I found for a really long time, as articulated in the first couple of episodes, that capability can be very misunderstood. In fact, as I said, for a really long time, I, like probably many of you, think of capabilities as people skills and their abilities. But we covered that in a bit more detail in the previous episodes. So what I wanted to talk about here is the fact that capability can actually become shorthand to mean a person or a team or even a job title. But unfortunately, this is problematic in itself. As an example, I'm running a program at the moment, and when we talk about specific capability in relation to some of the work that needs to be done, the work was referenced as someone, Johnny's job or Sarah's job. And that's because that individual has the capabilities in terms of the skill set, but also what they didn't consider is the outcomes, the processes, the tech, the data, all the other things that make up and underpin capabilities themselves. So yes, the person had knowledge and skills, but didn't actually have all of the other components. And so assuming that capabilities themselves are a direct correlation to an individual is not a good idea, because it impacts organizations from actually being able to produce the necessary outcomes when they have capabilities considered in a cohesive way. And so when we think about the times that I spend with organizations to help them understand the way to best introduce capabilities, or more the way to consider them in their organizations, I think of it in multiple layers. So first of all, when I think about capabilities, the way that I articulate and introduce it is to help an organization think about the capability as your organization or your team or your function's ability to do something. So think of it as the what. And then when I think about the next layer down, it's then thinking about what functions you have in an organization. Those functions are the structured groups of people: finance, marketing, HR, etc. Then you think about the roles. So when we talk about roles, this is where accountability comes into play. And then it's capacity, which we spoke about in episode 2. So this is around available effort. And basically between those 4 kind of criteria, they are all very different, but all interlinked. So as I said, capability is that enduring capability, the enduring what of a business, capacity being the available effort, roles introduce accountability, and then the functions is the grouping of people themselves. So it's really important to understand when we use any example, and I'll use one that I'm relatively focused on at the moment as part of some regulatory work I'm doing, you could pick a particular capability that might span risk areas, compliance areas, legal, operations, reporting. And when you think about that, there isn't a individual that is all those things, because the capability itself crosses over multiple functions. And so naturally it will cross over multiple people. And so although there may be one individual who's accountable for a capability, that capability may span multiple functions and teams and areas. And so there's a interplay there. So an organization, for example, that has to have the capabilities in place to be able to do what they need to do, they will often have to integrate across multiple functions, divisions, teams, etc. So this is where capabilities themselves are not functions. It's not a capabilities. There can be capabilities that sit in HR and in finance and marketing, but capabilities, if you think about like the value stream model, it's effectively capabilities that sit across your organization and they touch multiple different points. Some good examples of um, how organizations tend to confuse these layers is when they are resetting their organizational structure. Maybe they're acquiring a new business, maybe they're merging, demerging, any of those things. They'll often confuse structure and capability as the same thing, and that can tend to create problems longer term. Because if you are assuming your capabilities are mapped one-to-one to your functions, it actually doesn't make sense, because functions and organizational structures change more frequently than your capabilities. And so it's important to understand the structural difference between capability, function, accountability, and role. So that begs the question, why do organizations collapse capability to begin with into, the people elements? Why when we've got visual and visible org charts, do we struggle with aligning capabilities that are outside the realm of an org chart and outside the realm of the functions? We also think about the ability to think about governance structures that exist in organizations that do reward single point accountability. We also see leaders that currently consistently think in reporting lines, not operating systems. And we also see steering committees that want to know who owns something, not where it sits or where its accountable roll-up is. We find that there are a number of different instances where, when thinking about capability uplift in general, people will assume that they need to integrate and involve HR and human resources teams or talent acquisition, people and culture. Yes, they deal with capabilities, of course, but so does every function in an organization. They just focus a lot of their efforts on the people side of capability. But capability itself, as I mentioned in the earlier episodes, is about people, process, and tools including technology. And so it's people are conditioned to think of capabilities in that way. It's far easier to just assume capabilities sit at the functional level and think about capabilities being people and their roles than it is to actually unpack that and think about how there is actually cross-cutting capabilities that operate across an organization that is not as black and white as people may seem to think. So when collapsing capabilities into people, there are a few considerations to keep in mind. And some of those evidential consequences include things that really resonate, particularly around the places that I spend a lot of time in, and that is delivery fragmentation. So delivery becomes very challenging when there isn't clear accountability, not only on who is doing the work, but where it sits in organization and what it is that we're trying to do. Almost all delivery rolls up to one or more capabilities. And unless those capabilities are clearly defined from the outset, effectively sort of help the organizations. Think of it as like the governance spine in an organization, sort of underpins all of that. You can find that there is gaps at handover from delivery into BAU. You can find that there is rework a lot of the time. Often this gets picked up in audits. One big one that's something very familiar lately is the concept of program governance bloat. When capabilities are not being factored in as part of estimating and planning delivery initiatives and projects and programs at a portfolio level, what typically ends up happening is you get this significant bloat because people are not thinking about what the organization's needs to do cohesively across the people, process, and tools. They're only thinking about it from their individual silo. And so what happens is then they're accounting for uplift and changes to their areas and not actually thinking about it more cohesively. So again, this ends up resulting in inflated estimates. It ends up resulting in governance bloat. It also ends up resulting in structural difficulties around decisions, lines of accountability, and a number of other things as well. So ultimately, by thinking about those sort of key challenge areas, it ends up being something that, as an organization tends to scale, it duplicates and consistently exacerbates the problem. Another thing is, by not being clear on capabilities from the outset and just assuming it's a people problem, people will then assume that anything relating to a particular capability sits with that individual, and often it doesn't. As I said earlier, they're cross-cutting. And so it can actually really significantly impact execution. And this is why thinking about it from capabilities, one of the other really important considerations is the fact that when you build your organization based on functions and people alone and not the capabilities, it ends up significantly changing every time you have an org restructure or a significant change in leadership or something of the sort. So you want to avoid as much as you can conflating capabilities with people only. You want to think about capabilities more cohesively. The other thing to consider is that I mentioned briefly that capabilities are cross-functional, and they absolutely should be. Why? Because capabilities themselves, as I said, is about what an organization does. And usually what an organization does can't be achieved without your strategic elements, your delivery teams, and then your enabling and supporting functions as well. So you need to make sure that you are not only assigning you may assign capability owners, but you need to make sure that the capability itself is structurally cross-functional. And doing so can make sure that you eliminate bottlenecks and also make sure that you have clear line of sight to where the accountability stops and starts. What you want to also make sure is that you are factoring in ownership, not just of the capability, but also the process, the tools, and the aspects of people that directly link back to line management and similar things like that. So there is this whole misconstrued view on capabilities just relates to people. But as I said, it is much more broader than that. So if you think about it more holistically, the challenge we find here is by just simply thinking about it from a people side, it really doesn't help your organization when those people change. And I've seen so much structural damage when someone key or a single point of failure leaves an organization or there's a big change at the top. So you need to think about capabilities more broadly and think about it properly and think about what it could actually look like. So the best way to start thinking about that is to re-anchor, first of all, alignment on what capability means. And that's because people do have those mixed definitions. Think about capability overall as a system. It includes outcomes, processes, tools, data, technology, governance, roles, responsibilities, all of those sorts of things. And it's the individuals themselves, the people, which operate the system, than not the system themselves. So that means you can continuously evolve the system despite people changes, and the system shouldn't break. I'll give you a couple of examples. So when we think about a particular capability in the organization, and when I think about some of the recent clients we've dealt with, they might have specific type of capability in the, say, new product development space. Now, new product development is something that cross-cuts many different functions in an organization. And so there'll be aspects that link back to risk and quality, legal, product, operations, sales, marketing, almost every function of an organization. So you want to make sure that the accountabilities are clear up front, but the delivery itself to support the capability is actually distributed more broadly. And so governance, remember, governance doesn't equal delivery. I know sometimes people like to grade their own homework and misconstrue the two, but also capability doesn't equal headcount. So again, another mistake organizations tend to make is when they are doing their org charts or restructuring or undertaking a transformation that involves restructuring, they will often think about just the individuals themselves, not the capabilities that those people support. Remember, capabilities is the system and people support the system. So it's really important to not ever forget that. The other thing I'll just say as well is I know it can be quite challenging to move away from capabilities being people. So I'm okay if people continuously reference capabilities in the context of people, but I think it's important to understand that the capabilities and the people element are just one cog in the system, so to speak. So I think it's really important to help organizations understand that, particularly when you're undertaking a significant or large scale change. I'm undertaking a number of programs at the moment, and we've had to think in capabilities because otherwise we get down into too low a level of detail that doesn't really help the organization that we're building to actually, sustain itself long term, especially if it's built on existing functions or the individuals that are running those functions, because we know that those sorts of things change. So I think if you ultimately misdefine capability and don't get everybody on the same page with what it means, or everybody assumes it's X and it's actually Y, or you make it simply about the people and you neglect the process and tools element, you will likely misgovern it, you will likely misestimate, you will likely close some gaps prematurely and have other gaps open that can't be closed. And you'll also find that your underpinning operating rhythm and structures of your organization may feel chaotic at times, particularly when functions often operate in silos, whereas capabilities cross-cut across an organization. And so this is why it's really important and helpful to have that lens as well. In the next episode, we're going to talk about why strategy fails. And really, I'm going to emphasize rather why we see it all the time. Strategy is defined. Often you spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to have a big consulting firm put together a strategy, might be the best strategy in the universe. But the problem is that it's execution failure that impacts the strategy from actually being able to be achieved. So I hear a lot of statistics, the strategy failed, but when you dig deep and you go under the surface and you complete your quarterly reviews or your post-implementation reviews, or we're doing a bit of a diagnostic discovery for clients, I find that it's not the strategy that was failing, it was actually execution. And so sometimes there's some disconnect between the two. But we'll talk more about that in the next episode. Thank you so much for listening to this podcast. Please share this with someone or rate it if you enjoyed it. Don't forget to follow us on social media, and to stay up to date with all things Agile ideas, go to our website www.agilemanagementoffice.com. I hope you've been able to learn, feel, or be inspired today. Until next time, what's your Agile idea?